The day Mary Boleyn's life changed forever began with a shock that echoed through the halls of Blickling Hall, one of England's grandest Jacobean mansions. Nestled in the rolling landscapes of Norfolk, the estate was a place of beauty and privilege, surrounded by ancient woods and sweeping parklands. But on this particular morning, the air was thick with tension and the whispers of scandal. Mary, the youngest of the Boleyn siblings, was just a girl, but she was already aware of the world's complexities. Her brother George and sister Anne were the stars of the family, their futures bright with promise, but Mary was different. She was more reserved, more content to explore the gardens and the woods, where wildflowers bloomed and the eastern winds swept through the trees. It was in these gardens, where the Boleyn children had once played, that Mary's life took an unexpected turn. The news reached Blickling Hall like a storm. King Henry VIII, the most powerful man in England, was infatuated with Mary's sister Anne. The king's desire for Anne was so intense that he was willing to break with the Catholic Church and challenge the Pope to make her his queen. But before all of this, before Anne became the center of a political and religious revolution, Mary had been the king's first choice. Mary had been the king's mistress, a fact that was now whispered in hushed tones throughout the court. She had given birth to a child, a daughter, who some said was the king's. The child, born in secrecy, was a source of both pride and shame for the Boleyn family. Mary had always been the quieter, less ambitious of the Boleyn siblings, but now she was caught in a web of royal intrigue and family ambition. The day the news broke, Mary was in the garden, picking wildflowers. She heard the commotion from the house, the sound of rapid footsteps and muffled voices. She knew something was wrong. When she entered the house, she found her mother, Elizabeth, pale and tense, and her father, Thomas, pacing the room, his face a mask of worry and determination. "Mary, we need to talk," Thomas said, his voice stern but laced with a hint of fear. "The king has taken an interest in your sister, Anne. You must understand the gravity of this situation. Your past with the king could put all of us in danger." Mary's heart sank. She had always known that her relationship with the king was a secret, a delicate matter that could never be spoken of openly. But now, with Anne's rising star, that secret was threatening to unravel. She looked at her father, her mind racing with questions and fears. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas took a deep breath. "You must be careful, Mary. Your past with the king must remain a secret. If it comes out, it could ruin Anne's chances with the king and bring disaster upon our family. You must distance yourself from the court, at least for now. I will arrange for you to stay with our relatives in the countryside. It will be safer there." Mary nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. She would miss the court, the excitement, and the attention, but she knew her father was right. The Boleyn family's future hung in the balance, and she had to do her part to protect it. As she packed her things, Mary couldn't help but think about the years to come. Anne would rise to become queen, and George would follow in her footsteps, but Mary would remain in the shadows, her story a forgotten chapter in the Boleyn saga. She wondered if she would ever find her own path, a path that was not defined by the ambitions of her family or the desires of a king. The carriage that would take her away from Blickling Hall was already waiting. Mary took one last look at the estate, the place where she had grown up, and stepped into the carriage. As it pulled away, the familiar sights of Norfolk faded into the distance, and Mary's journey into an uncertain future began. Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard's marriage might have been a grand social match, but it wasn't a financial windfall. Elizabeth's father had to buy back his lands from the king, so her dowry wasn't much. This made things tough for Thomas, especially since Elizabeth kept having children. In a letter to Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Boleyn wrote, "When I married, I had only £50 a year to live on for me and my wife, as long as my father lived, and yet she brought me a child every year." This means Elizabeth was having a baby almost every year until around 1505. The constant need to support a growing family may have made Thomas more focused on money as he got older. Thomas and Elizabeth had several children, but only 4 survived to adulthood: Thomas, Mary, Anne, and George. One of their sons, Henry, is known to have died young, and there might have been others whose names we don't know. This frequent childbearing makes it unlikely that Elizabeth was a lady in waiting to Queen Elizabeth of York, who died in 1503, unless she had held that position before her marriage. However, there's no evidence to support this. There's been a lot of debate about which of the surviving daughters, Mary or Anne, was the oldest. Some people think Anne was the eldest, but there's good evidence that Mary was actually the older sister. Mary's grandson, George Carey, 2nd Baron Hunsdon, wrote in a letter in 1597 that his grandmother was the eldest daughter and the sole heir of Thomas Boleyn. He even claimed that Mary had pressed her claim to the earldom of Ormond, but the record of this claim doesn't exist anymore. If she had been successful, she and her husband, William Stafford, would have become Earl and Countess of Ormond. However, the earldom was given to Piers Butler in 1538, and the Butlers still held the title. George Carey believed he had a better right to the earldom than Queen Elizabeth I, who was also a co-heir through her mother, Anne. But since Elizabeth's rights to her mother's property were restored early in her reign, Mary could only be seen as a co-heir, not the sole heir. This meant that the Butlers' claim was stronger, and George never pursued his claim. Other evidence that Mary was the elder daughter comes from a note by William Camden, who said that Anne was begotten by Thomas Boleyn among other children. If Anne had been the eldest, Camden would have specifically mentioned it. Another historian, Nicholas Sander, also called Mary the elder of the Boleyn sisters in 1585. However, some sources have confused the issue. Ralph Brooke, a herald, wrote that Anne was the second daughter, but he contradicted himself by referring to Anne as the eldest elsewhere. Mary's great-granddaughter, Elizabeth Carey, who married into the Berkeley family, described Mary as the second daughter in a manuscript from 1584. This description was repeated on Elizabeth Carey's tombstone and in a later manuscript, but it might have been an error that was never corrected. John Weaver, writing in 1631, called Anne the eldest daughter, but his work has been criticized for being inaccurate and unreliable. On the other hand, George Carey's arguments are more compelling, especially since he had a personal stake in the matter. The dates of birth for the Boleyn siblings are also a topic of debate. The date of Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard's marriage isn't recorded, but it's thought to have been around 1498 or 1500. A jointure settled on Elizabeth around 1501 suggests the marriage had taken place recently, but it doesn't confirm the exact date. Anne Boleyn's birth date is particularly contentious. William Camden and Henry Clifford both stated that Anne was born in 1507. However, this doesn't fit with other evidence. William Roper claimed Anne was born in 1512, but this is too late because we have records of her at the court of Margaret of Austria in 1513. John Weaver also placed Anne's birth in 1507, but his dates are often confused. If Anne was born in 1507, she would have been only 6 when she was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria in 1513, which is unlikely. A well-authenticated letter written by Anne to her father in 1513-14, in the hand of a teenager, not a child, suggests that she was born around 1501. This is supported by Lord Herbert of Cherbury, who said Anne was 20 when she left the French court in 1522. Other sources suggest a birth date around 1499 to 1500. A date between 1499 and 1502, with 1501 being the most likely, is generally accepted. Since Mary was older than Anne, she must have been born around 1499 or earlier, possibly as early as 1498. Some have even suggested that she was named after the Virgin Mary or Princess Mary Tudor, which might place her birth around March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation. If true, this could mean her parents were married a year or two earlier than 1500. The Boleyn family's early years were marked by financial struggle and a large family. Despite this, Thomas and Elizabeth's legacy lived on through their children, particularly Anne and Mary, whose lives would have a profound impact on the Tudor court and the course of English history. Mary Boleyn and her siblings were born into a world of wealth and influence, shaped by the connections and ambitions of their parents, Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard. Mary, the oldest of the surviving Boleyn children, was likely born between 1496 and 1501. Her sister, Anne, who would later become Queen of England, was born around 1501, possibly named after St. Anne or their great-aunt, Anne Butler. Anne's name was also popular in the Boleyn family, with 2 or 3 of Sir William Boleyn's daughters named after his mother, Anne Who, suggesting a tradition of keeping the name within the family. Another possibility is that Anne was named after her aunt by marriage, Princess Anne of York, who was married to Elizabeth Howard's brother, Thomas, Earl of Surrey, in 1495. Mary's exact birth date is uncertain. but she was definitely older than Anne. Some historians suggest she could have been born as early as 1496, making her at least 12 years old by 1508. This fits better with the known events of her life, as it would have been unusual for a girl of her social standing to be sent to the French court at such a young age. Her younger brothers, Thomas and Henry, were likely the next in line, followed by George, who was probably the youngest of the 3 surviving siblings. George was described as being under 27 when he was appointed to the Privy Council in 1529, which suggests he was born around 1502 or 1503. He was also considered too young to be sent to France as an ambassador in 1529, further supporting this timeline. The Boleyn family's primary residence was Blickling Hall in Norfolk, where Mary and her siblings likely spent their early years. The house was surrounded by yew hedges and was a significant estate, although it no longer exists in its original form. In 1506, after the death of Sir William Boleyn, Thomas Boleyn moved his family to Hever Castle in Kent, which was more convenient for London and the court. Hever was a beautiful moated manor house, and it was here that Mary spent her formative years. The castle had a rich history, with parts dating back to the 13th century, and Thomas made several improvements to it, including adding a long gallery and mullioned windows. Thomas Boleyn's rise at court began in earnest after the death of Henry VII in 1509. He served as an esquire of the body to the new king, Henry VIII, a position that brought him into daily contact with the monarch. This role was one of great honor and trust, and it allowed Thomas to influence court politics and secure favors. His wife, Elizabeth Howard, rarely attended court, so she was the primary figure in the daily lives of her children, especially when Thomas was away on the king's business. Henry VIII's coronation in 1509 marked the beginning of a new era. The young king was praised for his good looks and virtues, and the court was filled with excitement and optimism. Thomas Boleyn's career flourished under the new king, and he was appointed to several important positions, including Keeper of the Exchange at Calais and a Knight of the Body. These appointments solidified his status and influence, setting the stage for the Boleyn family's future rise to power. Mary Boleyn grew up in a world where family connections and courtly favor were crucial. Her father's success at court meant that she and her siblings were part of a prestigious and ambitious family. While the exact details of her early life are not well documented, the environment in which she was raised was one of wealth, education, and political maneuvering. This background would shape her future and the path she would take in the years to come. In the early years of Henry VIII's reign, the young King of England was a picture of vigor and charm. Tall, slim, and fair-haired, Henry was a Renaissance man, a lover of the arts, sports, and learning. He had just married Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, and the union was initially filled with joy and affection. Henry wrote to his father-in-law, expressing his happiness, and Catherine, in return, professed her deep love for her new husband. However, the reality of royal marriage was more complex than personal feelings. A queen's primary duty was to produce an heir, and Catherine fulfilled this role by becoming pregnant almost immediately. But the early years of their marriage were marked by tragedy. 5 of their 6 children were either stillborn or died shortly after birth. Each loss took its toll on Catherine, and as the years passed, the age difference between them, Catherine was 5 years older, became more noticeable. She began to retreat into her piety, wearing a hair shirt and retiring early from court entertainments, which only widened the gap between her and the sociable, pleasure-seeking Henry. Henry's extramarital affairs began during these years, often when Catherine was pregnant and unavailable. One of his earliest known mistresses was Anne Hastings, the sister of one of his close friends, Sir William Compton. The affair was kept secret, with Compton providing cover by pretending to court Anne himself. However, the secret did not remain hidden for long. Anne's sister, Elizabeth, became suspicious and confided her concerns to her husband and brother. When the Duke of Buckingham confronted Compton, the matter reached Henry, who was furious at being deprived of Anne. He banished Elizabeth and her husband from court, but not before Elizabeth had revealed the affair to Queen Catherine. Catherine was devastated and confronted Henry publicly, leading to a heated argument. Henry, who saw his infidelity as a common practice among kings, was angered by her lack of discretion. In the end, Catherine learned to keep silent about her husband's affairs, but the damage to their relationship was significant. Henry's reputation as a womanizer grew over the years. He was known for his amorous complexion, and his court was filled with beautiful women. One of the most persistent rumors involved Elizabeth Howard, Lady Boleyn, the mother of Anne and Mary Boleyn. It was said that she had been Henry's mistress, a claim that gained traction as Anne Boleyn rose in the king's favor. However, there is little concrete evidence to support this rumor. Elizabeth Howard, after the coronation, was not often seen at court, and her absence may have been due to her husband's ambition or her own preference to stay away from the royal court's drama. The rumors about Lady Boleyn's supposed affair with the king were repeated by various people, including Friar William Peto and Elizabeth Amatis. However, when Henry was directly asked about these rumors, he denied any involvement with Elizabeth Howard. If the affair had been real, it would have complicated his later marriage to Anne Boleyn, as it would have made the union incestuous. Despite the lack of evidence, the gossip about the Boleyn family continued to spread. In 1533, a chantry priest in Yorkshire and a vicar in Isleworth both repeated the claim that Henry had had affairs with both Anne Boleyn's mother and sister. These rumors were likely fueled by the political tensions surrounding Henry's break with Rome and his marriage to Anne. Henry's affair with Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister, is better documented. Mary was known to be a lady in waiting to Queen Catherine, and had a reputation for being attractive and vivacious. It is believed that Henry's affair with Mary began around 1520, and lasted for several years. The affair was kept secret, but it was well known enough to cause gossip and speculation. In the end, Henry's infidelity and the political and personal complexities of his reign left a lasting mark on the history of England. The king's relationships, both within and outside his marriages, shaped the course of the English Reformation and the fate of many individuals at court. The story of Elizabeth Howard and Henry VIII is a tangled web of gossip, rumors, and historical speculation. Despite the numerous claims by hostile Catholic writers like Nicholas Harpsfield, William Rassell, and Nicholas Sander, there is little concrete evidence to support the idea that Elizabeth and Henry were lovers. These writers, who were staunchly opposed to Henry's break from the Catholic Church and his marriage to Anne Boleyn, had every reason to cast aspersions on Anne's legitimacy and her family's reputation. One of the most persistent stories is that Anne Boleyn was the result of an affair between Henry VIII and Elizabeth Howard. This theory was repeated by William Camden, though he was incorrect in claiming that Nicholas Sander was the first to spread this damnable lie. The story likely originated with Nicholas Harpsfield or William Rassell, both of whom had strong Catholic leanings and a deep resentment towards the Boleyns. Rassell, a printer and judge, edited Sir Thomas More's works and wrote a life of More that, although lost, was seen by Lord Herbert, who mentioned that Rassell claimed Anne Boleyn was the result of an affair between Henry VIII and Elizabeth Howard. Nicholas Sander, an exiled Catholic priest, also repeated this story, adding that Sir Thomas Boleyn was away on an embassy to France when Anne was conceived, and that Elizabeth admitted to Henry that he was the father. However, these claims can be easily disproven. Sir Thomas Boleyn was not sent to France until 1519, and Henry VIII was probably less than 10 years old when Anne Boleyn was born. The king himself denied the affair, and the sources that repeat these stories are all hostile to the Boleyns and to Henry's actions during the English Reformation. Elizabeth Howard's reputation, however, might have contributed to the believability of these rumors. The poet John Skelton, known for his satirical verses, compared Elizabeth to Cressida, a character from medieval literature who was famous for her infidelity. This comparison, along with Skelton's other barbed references in his poetry, suggests that Elizabeth might have had a reputation for being unfaithful. However, there is no direct evidence that she had an affair with Henry VIII. The Boleyns' marriage itself does not seem to have been particularly happy. Sir Thomas Boleyn spent most of his time at court or abroad, while Elizabeth lived in the country, only visiting the court on rare occasions. This was not unusual for the time, but it might have contributed to the rumors about Elizabeth's conduct. The real affair that Henry VIII had during this period was with Elizabeth Blount, a young woman who served as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Elizabeth Blount, or Bessie as she was known, was around 16 when she caught the king's eye. She later bore him a son, Henry Fitzroy, whom he acknowledged. This affair, unlike the alleged one with Elizabeth Howard, is well documented and adds to the complex picture of Henry VIII's personal life. In the end, the story of Elizabeth Howard and Henry VIII is a reminder of the power of rumor and the ways in which historical narratives can be shaped by those with specific agendas. While the evidence does not support the claim that Elizabeth and Henry were lovers, the rumors about her and her family continue to fascinate and intrigue historians and readers alike. The legacy of the Boleyns, with all its drama and controversy, remains a compelling chapter in the history of the English monarchy.